Picture the scene on the 24th of July, 1966. The jungle east of Nui Dat, mid-morning, the heat already pressing down through the canopy like a physical weight. Armored personnel carriers lined up on a dirt road, diesel smoke hanging in the still air. Young men in jungle green sitting on top of the vehicles, because inside them, the metal absorbs the sun and becomes an oven. 250 Australians moving out to find an army. They found it. Not the way anyone expected. Not in the way that produces a clear and decisive battle with a beginning and an end, and a body count that settles the question of who won. What they found in the jungle east of Nui Dat on the 24th of July, 1966, was 3 tons of rice, 70 gallons of cooking oil, tunnel systems honeycombing the red laterite soil, and camps whose cooking fires had gone cold within the last day. They found the larder of a force preparing to destroy them. They confirmed what they found, destroyed what they could, wrote their report, and went home. 12 days later, 108 of their friends walked back into the same plantation and found the army itself. This is not the story of what happened in those 12 days. This is the story of what happened in the 5 days before them, in the jungle around Long Tan village, in the operations rooms and intelligence reports of a task force that found everything it needed to know and did not fully understand what it was looking at. The evidence was present. The conclusion was not drawn. What that cost is a different story, and it has been told elsewhere. What has never been told with the precision it deserves is the story of the finding itself, of what 250 men discovered in 5 days of searching, of what a system trained by false alarms does when the real alarm finally sounds, and of why the gap between finding evidence and understanding it is one of the most consequential distances in military history. Open the file. To understand what 250 Australians were doing in the jungle east of Nui Dat on the 24th of July, 1966, you need to understand what Australia had decided it was doing in Vietnam, and why, and at what cost to the men it sent. Because the operation that morning did not begin with the morning. It began 4 years earlier, and 3,000 kilometers to the south, in a cabinet room in Canberra, with a calculation that seemed straightforward at the time, and would consume the country's conscience for decades. Australia had been sending military advisors to South Vietnam since 1962. 30 men at first, then more. Then, in April of 1965, Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced that Australia would commit a battalion to the war, citing a request for assistance from the South Vietnamese government, a request that historians would later establish had not, in fact, been received before the announcement was made. The logic of the commitment was the domino theory. If South Vietnam fell to communism, Southeast Asia would follow, and the threat would eventually reach Australian shores. Whether the theory was correct was a question that 17 years of involvement and 523 Australian dead would not settle to anyone's satisfaction. What Australia had negotiated before the first major troop commitment arrived was something American generals initially found irritating and eventually found difficult to argue with. The Australians wanted their own province, not a slice of someone else's war, not a battalion attached to a United States division and sent on search and destroy missions across the country. Their own area of operations, in which they could apply the doctrine they had developed and tested during the Malayan emergency of the 1950s. Patient, aggressive patrolling rather than massive firepower. Separation of the enemy from the population he needed to survive. The understanding that an insurgency is not defeated by killing insurgents, but by removing the conditions that sustain them. The Americans, under General William Westmoreland, measured success in body counts. The Australians found that metric, to use the word several of their battalion commanders actually used, contemptible. The province they were given was Phuoc Tuy, approximately 40 miles southeast of Saigon, far enough from the Cambodian and Laotian borders that North Vietnamese supply routes ran elsewhere, with no major American forces based within it, and weak South Vietnamese units that provided little competition for operational priority. General Sir John Wilton, the chief of the Australian General Staff, had argued for exactly this arrangement: a province where the Australians could fight their own war without being directed onto missions that conflicted with their doctrine. Phuoc Tuy was, in the most precise tactical sense, Australia's to run. The isolation that made it attractive was also what made it dangerous. There would be no large American formation close enough to reinforce quickly if the assessment of the threat proved wrong. The base they built was at Nui Dat, in the middle of the province, not on the safe coast near the logistics hub at Vung Tau, 30 kilometers to the south. This was deliberate. Wilton wanted the task force earning its ground rather than sitting behind wire on the coast and calling it control. The consequence was that when the first Australian task force arrived between April and June of 1966, it was constructing a camp in Viet Cong territory, watched from the Nui Din Hills to the west, probed at night along its 12-kilometer perimeter, and ringed by an enemy that had operated in the province for years and had no intention of leaving. The men building their bunkers at Nui Dat in May and June of 1966 were building them while being observed by the force they were supposed to be finding. To establish the security zone around Nui Dat, the Australians forcibly relocated the inhabitants of Long Phuoc and Long Hai villages. Approximately 3,000 people were moved. The Viet Cong described these as their two revolutionary villages, the human and logistical foundation of everything the movement had built in Phuoc Tuy over 2 decades. The political and human consequences of that resettlement were immediate and lasting. Families who had farmed the same land for generations were removed from it by a foreign military force and told they could not return. The resentment this produced was not theoretical. It was felt personally in every household displaced, and it fed directly into the recruitment and support networks that sustained the Viet Cong across the province. The people who were displaced did not become neutral. They became, or remained, active supporters of the men who were about to come looking for them. This is what the official security rationale for Line Alpha never fully acknowledged, and what the counterinsurgency doctrine the Australians claimed to follow should have prevented. The zone that was supposed to make the Australians safer was generating the human intelligence network that was making them less safe. The task force that settled at Nui Dat in mid-June of 1966 consisted of 2 infantry battalions, an armored personnel carrier squadron, an artillery regiment incorporating a New Zealand battery and a United States battery, a Special Air Service squadron, and supporting arms. Approximately 4,000 men at that point, ultimately growing to 8,000 at peak strength. It was the largest Australian force committed to a foreign conflict since the Second World War, rapidly assembled, unable to train together before departure. Many of its senior officers and non-commissioned officers carried extensive operational experience from Korea and Malaya. Many of its riflemen were in a country they had heard of for the first time in a government letter, carrying weapons they had been trained on for less than a year. Facing an enemy they understood only from doctrine and from whatever the man beside them had seen before. This is the truth, without which nothing that follows makes sense. These men were not invaders who arrived into a vacuum. They were the latest foreign military force to move through a province that had already been shaped by French colonialism, Japanese occupation, civil war, and a decade of insurgency. The villages the Australians were operating in or displacing had their own histories, their own grievances, their own relationships with the Viet Cong that predated the Australian task force by years. When D445 Battalion recruited from Dat Do and Long Dien and Hoa Long, it was drawing on communities whose connection to the revolution had grown from inside, from 2 decades of war and displacement, and the accumulated weight of what colonial and post-colonial violence does to ordinary people trying to survive it. The Australians arrived with good doctrine and genuine professionalism and a strategic framework that was better than most of what was being applied elsewhere in Vietnam. They also arrived without fully understanding the ground they were standing on. These two things were both true simultaneously, and both mattered enormously for everything that followed. The man who commanded the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, known in shorthand as 6 AR, was Lieutenant Colonel Colin Maurice Townsend. Born at Ingham in Queensland in 1927. Royal Military College, Duntroon, 1946. Graduating in 1948 to occupation duties in Japan before being among the first Australians sent to Korea in 1950. He rose through 2 decades of peacetime soldiering and won war, and by 1965, he was the officer the Army chose to build the battalion from nothing at Alamein Barracks in Inagara, Brisbane. He wrote the standard operating procedures used by all Australian infantry battalions in Vietnam. He took 6 RAR through the Jungle Training Center at Canungra and through the Shoalwater Bay training area and onto HMAS Sydney for the voyage north, arriving at Vung Tau in time to celebrate the battalion's first birthday in the sand dunes of the logistics base before moving forward to Nui Dat. The date of the battalion's founding was the 6th of June, 1965, which meant the birthday fell during the first week of a deployment that would end with 37 of the battalion's men dead and one of the most significant intelligence failures in Australian military history. Filed under a 2-word description that covered everything it needed to cover and explained almost nothing about what the evidence had actually said. Townsend was a professional's professional, formal, exacting, built for the weight of command in a way that made him effective and, to some men under him, difficult. He was not the kind of officer who rewarded informality, and he was not the kind of officer whose decisions invited debate. He had been selected to build 6 RAR because he was the kind of officer who gets things built on time and to specification, and he had done exactly that. The battalion he brought to Vietnam was trained, organized, and ready. What it was not was experienced, and in Phuoc Tuy in 1966, experience was the one thing that could not be supplied from Australia. Among the men who found Townsend difficult was the officer commanding D Company, Major Harry Arthur Smith. Harry Smith was born in Hobart, Tasmania, on the 25th of July, 1933. He had been a national serviceman first, then joined the regular army, graduating from the Officer Cadet School at Port C and posting to the 2nd Battalion in 1955. He served through the Malayan Emergency from 1955 to 1957, doing the kind of soldiering in jungle terrain against a communist insurgency that the Canungra training was built to replicate. It was in Malaya that he earned the nickname that would follow him everywhere. During a Christmas duty period at the battalion base at Kuala Kangsar, tasked with ending noise from barracks huts after lights out, he made repeated unsuccessful incursions into the offending areas until one night he walked into a hut and found a group of soldiers playing poker and 2-up in a condition he described as well, supplied with something stronger than regulation allowed. He announced something along the lines of, "At last, got you, you rats." From that night forward, he was Harry the Rat Catcher. After the events of August 1966, some men changed the second word. He preferred the original, and the preference tells you something specific about the man. He was not interested in mythology. He was interested in what actually happened. By 1966, Smith was a major commanding D Company, and his relationship with Townsend was strained in ways the sources note without fully resolving. What the record does establish is that D Company drew the difficult assignments with a frequency that several sources observe without quite explaining. Whether this reflected Townsend's confidence in the company's capability, the friction between the two men, or some combination of factors the sources cannot separate, is a question the documents leave open. What is not in question is the pattern itself. D Company went where the battalion's hardest assignments went, and Smith commanded D Company, and those two facts together would define the rest of his life in ways neither man could have anticipated when they moved out on the 24th of July. The battalion Townsend had built was not what its establishment tables suggested. A typical Australian battalion nominally fielded 792 men across 4 rifle companies, a support company, and an administration company. Each rifle company was supposed to number 123 men, 5 officers, and 118 enlisted. In practice, as the official history records, battalions were rarely at full strength. Illness, leave, and the gaps between tours kept the actual numbers below the nominal ones consistently. What the numbers cannot capture, and what matters more for this story than any specific headcount, is the composition of the men present. Alongside the regular soldiers and experienced non-commissioned officers who had been to Malaya or Korea were national servicemen, young men whose birthdays had been drawn from a marble and barrel lottery conducted by the Department of Labor and National Service. The selection was genuinely random. Some birthdays came up, and men went to Phuoc Tuy. Others did not come up, and their owners went to work. The allocation of who would face whatever Phuoc Tuy contained was conducted with the impartiality of a children's game, which is one of the things about it that is difficult to forgive. The ballot had been introduced in November of 1964, reinstating national service that Australia had abandoned in 1959. The government's argument was that the Army needed a larger pool of trained infantry, and the existing volunteer force was not sufficient to meet the commitment being contemplated in Southeast Asia. The opposition Labour Party opposed it consistently. The union movement opposed it. Save Our Sons, an organization of women formed in Sydney in 1965, ran campaigns against conscription that would grow into some of the largest sustained public protests in Australian history. In 1966, when the government announced that national servicemen would serve in combat in Vietnam, the opposition intensified into something closer to a national argument about what the country owed its young men and what its young men owed the country. None of it changed the policy. The marble barrel turned, the birthdays came up, and the young men reported for training. Some of them would be in the jungle east of Nui Dat on the 24th of July, searching tunnels and burning rice, learning in the most direct way available what the province contained. The training at Canungra and Shoalwater Bay was serious and demanding. Fire discipline, deliberate patrolling, mutual support under contact, the imperative of never leaving the dead, the mechanics of ambush and counter-ambush in jungle terrain, the specific physical and psychological requirements of infantry soldiering in tropical conditions. What it could not replicate was the specific texture of Phuoc Tuy. The rubber plantations with their rows of straight-trunked trees, creating sight lines that were both useful and deceptive. The monsoon rain that arrived with no warning and reduced visibility to meters in 30 seconds. The Viet Cong doctrine of swarming a smaller force from multiple directions simultaneously, with a speed and coordination that had nothing to do with the irregulars of Western imagination. The particular challenge of fighting an enemy whose most important asset was not its weapons, but its intimate knowledge of every square meter of the ground it was fighting on. These things they would learn in the province itself. The learning had a cost that training could reduce, but not eliminate, and the cost would be paid in the currency that armies always pay it in. What was already in Phuoc Tuy when the Australians arrived had been there for years and was not going anywhere. The Viet Cong 5th Division, headquartered in the Mae Tao Mountains, operated across Phuoc Tuy, Bien Hoa, and Long Con provinces, with a combined estimated strength of approximately 4,000 500 men. The 274th Regiment, the stronger of the two main force regiments, at approximately 2,000 men in 3 battalions, was based in the northwest of the province. Experienced and well-equipped, the unit rated most capable of the conventional warfare that a direct assault on Nui Dat would require. The 275th Regiment, approximately 1,850 men under Senior Captain Nguyen Thoi Bung, known operationally as Ut Thoi, was based in the Mae Tao Mountains and operated predominantly in the east of the province, in the rubber plantation country and the jungle east of Nui Dat, in precisely the terrain where 6 RAR would conduct Operation Hobart. In support was an artillery battalion equipped with 75mm recoilless rifles, 82mm mortars, and 12.7mm heavy machine guns, along with engineer, signals, sapper, and medical units whose full composition the Australian intelligence picture in mid-1966 had not yet established, with the precision that would have changed the operational planning. The unit that would matter most for this story was neither of the main force regiments. It was the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion. Formed on the 19th of May, 1965, the same year 6 RAR was raised, D445 recruited principally from the villages of Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long, which are the villages of Phuoc Tuy. Its men were not strangers operating in unfamiliar terrain under orders from a distant headquarters. They were the sons of the province. Every track the Australians would patrol, every paddy they would cross, every family living along every route the task force would use, every approach to every position the Australian patrols would occupy, every drainage line that would be impassable after rain, and every firm ground that would hold the weight of armored vehicles. D445 knew all of it, with the intimacy that comes from having grown up inside it, and from having spent the preceding years using it operationally against the previous foreign military force that had occupied the same territory. Their intelligence network was not a formal apparatus requiring maintenance and communication resources. It was the web of family and community and shared history that connects every person in a rural province to every other person, and that a foreign military force, however well-intentioned and well-trained and professionally competent, cannot replicate, penetrate, or effectively compete with in the time available. Numbering approximately 350 men in 3 rifle companies and a weapons company, the battalion would be assessed by the Australian Task Force in 1971, after 5 full years of operations against it, as one of the most formidable forces with which the task force has had regularly to contend, rated equivalent in capability to a main force Viet Cong unit. In mid-1966, they were at peak strength and peak confidence, and they had the recent combat record to justify both. During Operation Hardihood in May of that year, a company of the United States 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, had lost 12 killed and 35 wounded in a single engagement with a D445 company. Whatever the Americans expected from a provincial mobile battalion, D445 was not it. That engagement had happened before the Australians arrived in Phuoc Tuy. D445 had beaten an American company and walked away, and the lesson it drew from that engagement was that the foreign forces in the province were not invincible. The lesson the Australians were about to provide would be a different one, but in July of 1966, that lesson had not yet been taught. The 275th Regiment had been given a mission before the Australians built their first bunker at Nui Dat. It was ordered to move against the Australian base and destroy it, not as a contingency to be activated under certain conditions, as a primary operational objective. The Viet Cong had controlled Phuoc Tuy for years, and the response to a foreign force building a permanent base in the middle of their territory was not to wait and observe and adjust to the new reality. It was to prepare the means of removing the foreign force before it established itself too deeply to be moved. The 275th Regiment's commanders understood that a 2-battalion task force, newly arrived, still building its defenses, still learning the province, still operating with the inevitable inefficiencies of a force in the first months of a new deployment, was more vulnerable in July of 1966 than it would be in September or December or the following year. The window for the kind of assault they were planning was not unlimited. The food for that assault had been pre-positioned in the jungle east of Long Tan. The Australians were about to find it. 6. RAR's first major operation in Vietnam, Enoggera, ran from the 21st of June to the 5th of July. D Company's assignment was the destruction of Long Phuoc village, the tunnels and hides that honeycombed the area, the caches of food and supplies, the underground infrastructure of a village that had functioned as a Viet Cong support base for years. Among what they found were incense burners and cooking equipment, and the evidence of a community that had maintained its tunnel network with discipline and sustained effort over a long period. The incense burners were recovered as souvenirs by some of the soldiers, including Harry Smith, who brought one back to Australia. They are now in museum collections, small objects that carry the specific weight of things removed from places that were fought over and then left. Among what happened to the men during the operation was Private Paul Large of 12 Platoon. Bitten during a lunch break by one of the large black venomous scorpions of Phuoc Tuy rather than the small translucent brown ones, because in Phuoc Tuy the smaller hazard was routinely accompanied by a larger one that the smaller one did not advertise. His platoon commander, 2nd Lieutenant Dave Sabian, determined that evacuation was necessary. Large's temperature was climbing within 15 minutes in a way that made the decision straightforward. He was carried out. The search continued without him, which is the texture of what operations in Phuoc Tuy actually looked like. Not continuous heroism and contact, but the grinding daily work of searching a province in heat and humidity, interrupted by scorpion bites and medical evacuations and the 100 small difficulties that do not appear in official histories, but that the men who were there remember as the substance of the experience. The pattern that would matter most in this story was not any single contact during Enoggera. It was the structure accumulating across operations from the battalion's first weeks in Phuoc Tuy. Intelligence report of a significant enemy presence. Battalion deploys in response. Patrols find limited evidence or no sustained contact with a force of the reported size. Battalion returns to base. Before Hobart, there had been reports of a Viet Cong battalion inside Line Alpha. 2 heavily armed Chinook helicopters were sent to strafe the reported position. The ground fire coming back up at them was intense enough that the pilots reported they were receiving more than they were giving, which confirmed a significant force was genuinely present in the area. 6 RAR deployed in response. The contact was limited. The battalion returned. Each time the alarm proved less catastrophic than the intelligence suggested, the credibility of the next alarm declined by a measurable degree. Not because anyone made a deliberate decision to discount intelligence reports, or because the officers involved were professionally inadequate. Because the human mind, presented with repeated evidence that a warning system consistently overestimates the threat, adjusts its calibration accordingly. This is not a failure of courage or professional judgment. It is a failure of pattern recognition at the institutional level, and it is the kind of failure that only becomes clearly visible in retrospect, when the alarm that the system had learned to calibrate downward turns out to be the one that was right all along. By the end of July, SAS patrols operating east of Nui Dat had detected a large enemy force near the abandoned village of Long Tan. The intelligence picture was sufficient for Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, the task force commander, to order a battalion-scale search and destroy operation. The operation was codenamed Hobart. Its mission was to search and destroy the enemy in the area northeast and east of Long Tan village, and to search Long Tan itself for Viet Cong installations and caches. The specific threat named in the intelligence was D445 Battalion. The broader picture suggested a more significant presence than D445 alone could account for. But that broader picture was not yet coherent enough to act on with the kind of confidence that produces a different scale of response or a different level of alertness in the base left behind. On the 24th of July, 1966, 6 RAR moved east from Nui Dat. The armored personnel carriers of A Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment provided the armored element. Their tracks, throwing red laterite dust on a morning already approaching 30 degrees. The jungle east of Nui Dat in late July is rubber plantation country. The Long Tan plantation, planted by French colonists before the war that removed them, its rows of identical straight-trunked trees, creating corridors that the eye follows and the mind tries to read as tactical space. The rows have a quality in the morning light that experienced jungle soldiers learn to distrust. The repetition of them, the way each corridor looks exactly like the one before it and exactly like the one after it. So that orientation within the plantation requires deliberate attention to compass bearings and the occasional drift of a patrol's direction across the parallel rows is almost inevitable without constant correction. Beyond the plantation, secondary jungle, understory, the particular quality of tropical light that comes through a closed canopy in the morning, before the heat has fully committed itself and before the afternoon rain has begun to announce itself in the way that Phuoc Tuy rain announces itself, which is to say without warning and at maximum intensity. The soldiers rode on the tops of the armored personnel carriers when they could, because inside them the steel held the heat of the previous day and the growing heat of this one, and the air inside was not air in any comfortable sense of the word. They moved east through the dust and the light, and the jungle received them, and the sounds of Nui Dat behind them disappeared into the vegetation, and there was only the task. The first thing the operation found was scale. Not a patrol cache, not a temporary hide, not the remnants of a force that had been passing through on its way to somewhere else and had left behind what it could not carry. What the tunnels and the camps and the cleared areas of the jungle east of Long Tan village revealed, systematically and with growing clarity across the first 2 days of the operation, was the infrastructure of a sustained and organized military presence that had been maintained over years. The tunnels were not improvised, field work scratched out under pressure by a unit in temporary occupation of unfamiliar ground. They had been dug with intent and engineering, reinforced with timber at the critical load-bearing points, connected in a system that indicated not occasional use, but sustained occupation by significant numbers of men who expected to be in this area for an extended period and had made the physical arrangements that expectation requires. Ventilation passages to manage the heat and moisture of the laterite underground. Storage areas built and oriented to keep grain dry across the wet season, when the water table in Phuoc Tuy rises and anything stored on or near the ground surface absorbs moisture. Sleeping positions large enough to hold a platoon, and in some cases constructed to accommodate considerably more than a platoon without requiring men to sleep in contact with each other in the heat. The camps varied in size along what were clearly established and maintained supply routes that the jungle vegetation had been arranged to conceal from aerial observation, and that followed the terrain in ways that indicated whoever had selected them understood the drainage patterns, the firm ground, the sight lines of the surrounding plantation and jungle, and the approach routes that a ground patrol would most naturally take when moving through the area, in the same detail that only extended residence in a specific landscape produces. Transit stops along those routes were sized and equipped for their function, some capable of sheltering a platoon moving through over a single night, others capable of accommodating a company-sized element for several days, all of them showing the evidence of regular, planned use rather than emergency improvisation. Cleared ground maintained against the constant regrowth of the jungle. Fire sites built in the specific way that minimizes smoke, visible from aerial observation, while still allowing cooking. Latrine arrangements positioned at the distance from sleeping and food storage areas that indicates awareness of hygiene and the specific diseases that poor field sanitation produces in tropical conditions. The organization told a story about a force that was not improvising its logistics in this area. It was running them. Documents were recovered, their contents requiring translation and analysis that would take longer than the operation itself had available. Small arms ammunition in quantity, stored and organized rather than abandoned in the rush of contact, or cached in small quantities against future need. Cooking equipment left in place with a deliberateness that suggested the people using it had chosen to leave rather than been forced to leave, had received enough warning to make considered decisions about what to take and what to abandon, and had concluded that cooking equipment was replaceable, and their time was not. They left in something less than an emergency, and something more than a casual withdrawal in the specific pacing that indicates a disciplined force executing a planned disengagement, rather than a surprised force reacting to unexpected contact. This is not the behavior of a force caught unprepared. It is the behavior of a force that had observed the Australians preparing to move and had calculated, correctly, that the right response was to remove the personnel and leave the equipment. Then the rice, 3 tons of it, 70 gallons of cooking oil. The Australian War Memorial's own caption on photographs taken during the operation states plainly what the 5-day search confirmed. Long Tan was confirmed as being a well-used transit area for Viet Cong. 3 tons of rice is not a patrol cache. A patrol cache is measured in kilograms and is designed to be carried forward when the time comes to move. Small enough to be practical as a carried load, large enough to sustain the men it is intended for across the period of the operation. 3 tons of rice is not designed to be carried forward. It is not portable in any meaningful tactical sense for a light infantry force moving through jungle. It is designed to be drawn from incrementally by a force that knows where it is, that has the time and the local knowledge to return to it repeatedly, and that intends to remain in the operational area long enough for a depot of that scale to be necessary. It is a supply depot. It is the logistical foundation of sustained operations in this specific area by a force large enough, and planning a presence in this area extended enough that those responsible for supplying it had judged it worthwhile to pre-position tons of grain in the jungle rather than moving smaller quantities forward as required and returning for more when those quantities were consumed. Someone had brought 3 tons of rice to the jungle east of Long Tan and left it there because they intended to need it. This is not an ambiguous finding. It is a logistical statement of intent, written in the most direct language that logistics uses. The political officer of the D445 Battalion had described the province's rice fields as the breast milk of the revolution, the nutritional foundation of everything the movement had built in Phuoc Tuy across 2 decades of sustained struggle. That description was not poetic license deployed for motivational purposes at a unit political meeting. It was operational doctrine expressed in human terms. The Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy did not eat from supply lines running south from Hanoi along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They ate from the province they were fighting in, from the rice paddies of Dat Do and Long Dien and Hoa Long, from the farming communities whose produce sustained the movement and whose sons formed the battalion that was now watching from the tree line as the Australians moved through its storage areas and burned what they could reach. What 6 RAR found in those tunnels and burned in those clearing operations was not surplus stock that a well-organized logistics system could easily replace from other sources without disruption to the operational timeline. It was the carefully accumulated food supply of a force in the final stages of preparation for a specific and planned operation, pre-positioned at the location from which that operation was intended to be supported over its expected duration. The Australians found it, confirmed its presence, burned what they could carry fire to, and moved on. They did not yet understand what operation the food was pre-positioned for. They would understand it 12 days later, in the same plantation, under different circumstances entirely. From the far side of that jungle, the watching had been going on for days before the operation even began. D445 Battalion did not need to be in the Australians' field of view to track their movements with precision. Every track the patrols used, every approach to every cache site, every clearing where the armored personnel carriers stopped and the soldiers dismounted to search on foot, every overnight position the companies occupied, every direction the patrols moved when they left each position. D445 knew from the same intimate knowledge of the terrain that tells a man where every path in his own village leads and what sound a stranger's footstep makes on each different kind of ground. The battalion that the 1st Australian Task Force would later describe as one of the most formidable forces with which the task force has had regularly to contend, was not hiding from the Australians during Operation Hobart in any meaningful sense. It was observing them, was watching a foreign military unit move through its supply base, locate and destroy what it found, and follow the search pattern that its doctrine and training had given it. It was noting what the Australians found and what they missed, how long they stayed at each location, in which direction they moved when they left each position, and what the pace and pattern of the search suggested about how much of the area would be covered before the operation ended and the battalion returned to base. This information was directly useful to the planning of what came next. The rice cache being burned was a setback, manageable in the larger operational calculation. The timing of the planned assault was worth considerably more than any individual cache, and the observation of the Australian search pattern was contributing directly to the decision about when that timing should be executed. On the 25th of July, at 13:08 hours, contact became unavoidable. C Company engaged an enemy force of company strength, approximately 100 men. The action lasted approximately 30 minutes. C Company used small arms and called artillery. The Viet Cong returned small arms and mortar fire and were forced to withdraw south under the combined pressure of direct fire and the artillery arriving from the guns at Nui Dat. B Company had been positioned as a blocking force across the likely withdrawal route, the correct application of the forces available to a commander who anticipated the enemy would attempt to break contact in a particular direction. The Viet Cong took that route because they had no better option available in the time they had to choose one. B Company's sentries watched them moving through the trees toward the blocking position, the movement visible through the plantation rows, the discipline of the force maintaining its formation, even in withdrawal. The Viet Cong fired mortars and then assaulted directly into B Company's positions with the aggression and coordination of a unit that was not attempting to escape contact, but was attempting to fight through a blocking force on its preferred withdrawal route. B Company repulsed the assault with small arms and artillery support. The enemy broke off contact and withdrew south and east into the plantation and the jungle beyond it, moving with the discipline of a unit that had chosen to disengage rather than a unit that had been forced to. During both actions on the 25th of July, the Viet Cong passed orders by bugle. The sound of those calls echoed across the plantation rows, clear above the noise of the firefight, distinct and deliberate, the specific acoustic signature of a disciplined force using a communication method that training at Canungra had described, but that the soldiers of 6 RAR were hearing for the first time in this war. The bugle calls were not a relic of an earlier era of warfare being used by a force too technologically limited for modern communication. They were a deliberate tactical choice by a unit that understood the operational environment it was working in with the specificity that only extended experience in that environment produces. They carried no electronic signature that the signals intelligence equipment at Nui Dat could detect and locate. No radio frequency that could be tracked or jammed. No equipment that could be captured or denied to the force by the destruction of supply routes. The calls were reliable, effective across the distances involved in a company-level engagement in rubber plantation terrain, and audible through the noise of the combat without requiring the caller to move from their position or expose themselves to observation. The official record noted that the calls echoed many times over the battlefield, which is a detail that sounds atmospheric and is in fact operationally significant. The echo pattern of bugle calls through rubber plantation rows, with its characteristic doubling and spatial confusion, made it genuinely difficult for listeners to precisely locate the caller from the sound alone. D445 was not communicating by bugle because it lacked better options. It was communicating by bugle because the commanders who chose the method had understood, from experience against forces equipped with the signals intelligence capabilities the Australians possessed, that this was the smarter choice. The unit engaged on the 25th of July was D445 Battalion. The official record of 6 RAR's first tour states this without qualification. Operation Hobart saw the battalion come into contact with the enemy Provincial Mobile Battalion, D445, which was at that point at the peak of its strength, morale, and fighting capability. This is not a retrospective assessment shaped by anything anyone knew in the weeks that followed. It was the assessment made at the time by the officers who had just conducted 2 simultaneous company-level engagements and watched D445 disengage in good order. A force that fires mortars accurately at a company it has not previously located, coordinates a direct assault on a blocking position, while the main body is conducting a separate firefight 200 meters away, passes orders by bugle with the precision the engagement demonstrated, and withdraws south and east without losing unit cohesion, is not a force that has been defeated. It is a force that chose to disengage on its own terms, at a time of its own choosing, having completed the part of the engagement it had decided to engage in. D445 on the 25th of July did not break contact. It concluded the engagement and withdrew. There is a difference, and the difference was visible to anyone who watched how it was done. Private William Joseph Winterford, C Company, was at his machine gun when the Viet Cong opened fire that afternoon. The enemy had positioned 2 machine guns to suppress C Company's position from firing positions that were accurately engaging the company at range. Winterford engaged both enemy guns in sequence, exercising the fire control that training had built, and that the qualities of the man confirmed under the specific pressure of taking aimed fire while trying to shoot back, and neutralized both. When an attack then developed on the right flank of his platoon position, he turned his machine gun on the attacking force with sufficient effect that the enemy was forced to withdraw from that flank. A burst of enemy fire then destroyed the weapon and entered his left arm. He was bleeding, in significant pain, and still under fire from multiple directions. He remained in his position. He continued to direct and inspire the men around him until he was evacuated at the conclusion of the engagement. His military medal citation records that he conducted himself in such a courageous manner as to set an example and inspire those fighting with him. He was sent back to Australia at the end of August. He is one of the few men from Operation Hobart whose individual action in those 5 days in the jungle east of Long Tan produced a named formal recognition. The other names from that operation appear on a different kind of list, the one that records the dead rather than the decorated. The operation's confirmed results when 6 RAR returned to Nui Dat on the 29th of July. 13 Viet Cong killed, 19 wounded. 2 Australians killed, 17 wounded. Several Viet Cong camps of varying sizes located and destroyed. Tunnel systems destroyed. 3 tons of rice and 70 gallons of cooking oil destroyed. The entire area confirmed as a major Viet Cong logistical transit zone. The D445 Battalion encountered and engaged on 2 separate occasions in a single afternoon, and confirmed at the peak of its strength and fighting capability in the area immediately east of the Australian Task Force base. These were the confirmed results. What was not in the results was a confirmed understanding of what the 3 tons of rice had been pre-positioned to support, or why D445 at the peak of its strength was operating in this specific area at this specific moment, or what the connection was between the scale of the logistical infrastructure found and the intelligence picture that was assembling simultaneously through other channels. These questions were present in the evidence. They were not answered by the report. Then, on the 29th of July, as 6 RAR was preparing to begin a detailed follow-up search of Long Tan village itself, Brigadier Jackson ordered the battalion's immediate return to Nui Dat. South Vietnamese intelligence had reported a large Viet Cong presence near the base. Jackson could not afford to have his only reserve battalion committed in the field if the base itself was under imminent threat from a direction the search had not yet covered. The decision was correct, given what he knew at that moment. The detailed search of Long Tan village that might have found what the initial sweep had not found never took place. Whatever the village contained remained there. The battalion came home, and the report was written, and the file was closed. What was filed when 6 RAR returned from Hobart was accurate as far as it went. The area was a major Viet Cong transit zone. D445 had been encountered and engaged at the peak of its strength and fighting capability. Significant logistical material had been found and destroyed. The conclusions were appropriate to the evidence as it appeared to the men who gathered it. What the evidence actually signified was a conclusion the intelligence system was not, by the end of July of 1966, positioned to draw with the confidence that would have changed what happened next. 3 tons of rice tells a specific story if you read it at face value, rather than through a filter shaped by previous operations. A supply depot does not say the same thing as a transit cache. The difference is not subtle. What 6 RAR found was a depot, and the report described it as a transit zone, and the transit zone description was accurate in the same way that calling a staging area a gathering point is accurate. Technically defensible, operationally insufficient as a characterization of what the evidence actually meant. Australia's 547 Signal Troop, a signals intelligence unit operating at Nui Dat, had been monitoring a Viet Cong radio transmitter since early August. The transmitter had been identified as belonging to the 275th Regiment. That identification carried specific weight. Viet Cong units below regimental level rarely possessed radio equipment. A regimental radio did not travel independently of the regiment that owned it. The 547 Troop tracked the transmitter through the first 2 weeks of August, watching its located position move toward Nui Dat. By approximately the 6th of August, the transmitter had been located near the Nui Dat 2 feature, on the edge of the Long Tan rubber plantation. The same ground where 6 RAR had burned 3 tons of rice 13 days earlier. The same ground where D445 had fought B and C companies on the 25th of July. The same ground that the detailed follow-up search of Long Tan village had not been able to complete before the battalion was recalled on the 29th of July. The picture was assembling with a coherence that the individual pieces had not separately made legible. The cache, the D445 contact at peak strength, a regimental radio station area at the edge of the Long Tan plantation. Each piece pointed in the same direction. Together, they described a staging area being occupied by a force in the final preparation stages for a planned operation against a specific target. The target was Nui Dat. The food for the operation had been found and burned. The force itself had not been found. It was still there. Brigadier Jackson sent his intelligence officer, Captain Robert Keep, to United States 2 Field Force Vietnam headquarters in Saigon with the assembled intelligence picture and a formal request for reinforcements. The response was skepticism, verging on dismissal. The American intelligence picture did not support the Australian estimate. The Australians were, in the colloquial summary that entered the historical record, almost laughed out of court. The request for reinforcements was denied. Jackson returned to Nui Dat with 2 battalions and a picture that was assembling faster than the system could act on it. By the night of the 16th of August, the question remained unresolved. At 2:43 in the morning on the 17th of August, 1966, the Viet Cong answered it. 22 minutes of mortar and recoilless rifle fire from positions 2 kilometers east of Nui Dat. 67 craters across the base area, 24 soldiers wounded. D445's political officer would later confirm that his battalion had provided guides for the units that conducted the mortar strike. The men whose Rice 6RAR had burned on the 25th and 26th of July guided the mortar teams to their positions and waited while the rounds fell on the base they considered to be within their province and their right to contest. On the 18th of August, 1966, D Company of 6RAR was ordered east to search the area and locate the enemy mortar positions. 108 men. The intelligence estimate held that the enemy was likely a heavy weapons platoon of D445 Battalion, numbering approximately 30 to 40 men. The enemy was thought long gone. The company commander, Major Harry Smith, recalled that he and his men were not real happy at missing the concert as they moved out, a reference to the first live entertainment the task force had received in nearly 3 months, a performance by a 17-year-old singer named Little Patty and the musician Colonel Joye and his band, scheduled for that afternoon at Nui Dat. They could hear the music from the base as they walked east into the rubber plantation. Then the jungle absorbed the sound, and there was only the march and the heat and the rows of trees. At 3:15 in the afternoon, D Company walked into the right flank of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment. What D Company found in the Long Tan rubber plantation at 3:15 in the afternoon on the 18th of August was not a heavy weapons platoon of 30 to 40 men thought long gone. It was the 275th Viet Cong Regiment, reinforced by D445 Battalion and attached units, an estimated 2,500 soldiers, of whom between 1,500 and 2,000 took direct part in the assault, against 108 Australians, in the same plantation where, 24 days earlier, 6RAR had found 3 tons of rice and confirmed a Viet Cong logistical hub and called it a transit zone. A monsoon thunderstorm struck at approximately the moment of contact, reducing visibility in the rubber plantation rows to meters. The radio log of the battle records 4 messages that together describe the arc of a company fighting for its life in a way that no subsequent account has improved upon. 4:26 in the afternoon, being mortared, want all artillery possible. 4:31, enemy on left flank, could be serious. 5:01, enemy penetrating both flanks and to north and south. 5:02, running short of ammo. Required drop through trees. The artillery at Nui Dat fired almost without pause for 5 hours. 2 Royal Australian Air Force Iroquois helicopters flew into the plantation in near zero visibility, hovering at treetop level in the monsoon rain, dropping boxes of ammunition wrapped in blankets to the men in the mud below. A relief force of 7 armored personnel carriers, under Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, moved out from Nui Dat, crossed a swollen creek, and arrived at 6:25 in the evening to catch a D445 company forming up south of D Company's position for a final encirclement. The last contacts occurred at 7:15 in the evening. 18 Australians were dead. 24 were wounded. At least 245 Viet Cong bodies were counted on the battlefield the following morning. Captured documents confirmed total casualties exceeding 500 killed and approximately 800 wounded. D445 Battalion lost approximately 70 killed and 100 wounded, from a strength of 350. Roughly half the battalion destroyed in the plantation, where 3 weeks earlier its supply base had been located and burned by the same battalion whose soldiers it had just fought. The Battle of Long Tan was a strategic Australian victory. The 275th Regiment did not reappear in Phuoc Tuy in significant operational strength for months. The force ordered to destroy Nui Dat had been broken before it reached the wire. It was also the direct consequence of evidence that had been found, confirmed, partially understood, and filed under a description that was technically accurate and operationally insufficient. The 3 tons of rice had said an army was coming. The army came. The system that received the report about the rice was not, by the end of July of 1966, in a position to hear what the rice was saying with the precision required to act on it before the army arrived. The men who paid for the gap between evidence and conclusion are on the roll. 18 names. The gap itself is not on any list. Harry Smith came home and spent the next 42 years fighting for his soldiers to be recognized in the official record at the level their service deserved. His military cross, recommended as a distinguished service order by both Townsend and Jackson in the immediate aftermath of the battle, had been downgraded by the Commander Australian Force Vietnam, operating within a quota system that determined the grade of awards a battalion could receive, regardless of what had actually occurred. The official historian Ian McNeill wrote his verdict on the decorations awarded to D Company in the endnotes of his definitive account. Not the text. The endnotes. He wrote that the system of allocation of medals by quotas had produced a result that was little short of insulting in view of the heroism displayed. That sentence is where a reader who does not check the complete apparatus of the official history will never find it. In 2008, 42 years after the battle, Smith's award was upgraded to the Star of Gallantry. He died in Buderim, Queensland, on the 20th of August, 2023, 2 days after the 57th anniversary of the battle he commanded, aged 90. His nickname remained Harry the Rat Catcher, by his own preference, unchanged by the events of August 1966 or anything that followed them. 250 Australians moved east from Nui Dat on the 24th of July, 1966, and spent 5 days in the jungle finding things. They found tunnels built for sustained occupation and camps sized for a force planning to operate from them rather than pass through them. They found documents and ammunition and cooking equipment left behind by men who had chosen to leave rather than been forced to. They found D445 Battalion at the peak of its strength and fighting capability, engaged it on 2 occasions in a single afternoon, listened to its bugle calls echo across the rubber plantation rows, and confirmed that the area east of the Australian base was a major Viet Cong operational presence rather than a transit corridor. They found 3 tons of rice pre-positioned in quantities that only a force planning to remain in the area would need. They burned what they could reach. They confirmed what they found. They wrote a report that described the area as a well-used Viet Cong transit zone, which was accurate as far as it went, and went home. They did not know what it meant, not because they were careless or insufficiently professional or lacking in the intelligence or the courage that this kind of work requires in the specific conditions of Phuoc Tuy in July of 1966, because the system they were part of had been taught, by 8 weeks of partial contacts and calibrated alarms, to expect less than the evidence said, because 3 tons of rice in a jungle, to a system that has learned to expect alarms to be overstated, looks like evidence of movement rather than evidence of intent, because the gap between those two readings is invisible inside the system that produces them, and obvious to anyone reading the evidence from outside it and from a distance of 60 years. Because the 275th Regiment's radio was stationary at the edge of the same plantation, and the American headquarters in Saigon had almost laughed the intelligence officer out of court, and the pattern of the preceding 8 weeks said that the alarm was probably, once again, larger than the reality. And because on the 18th of August, 1966, 12 days after the rice was burned, and the report was filed, and the battalion returned to Nui Dat, the force whose food it was came back to Long Tan and proved, at a cost of 18 Australian lives, that the evidence had been right all along, and the system that discounted it had been wrong. Now you know what they found, and now you know what it meant.